The government doesn't know how to rule. The president and his people are corrupt.
It's been a week of outrage on the streets of Tunisia. The government has brought in new price hikes for goods like cars and phones to shrink its budget deficit. But protesters say the cuts will hurt the poorest most.
They increased income tax by 1%. If a father of a poor family loses 10 dinars a month, that's 6 or 8 litres of milk he can no longer buy.
Days of violent confrontations in several regions have led to hundreds of arrests and dozens of injured police officers. The government is accusing young vandals and looters of being behind most of the unrest. In one town, a man was killed, and demonstrators blame the police.
What these people want is to display mistakes by the security forces against protesters in order to fuel popular discontent.
Rumblings of popular discontent tend to cause concern that Tunisia might go through another revolution. The country has often been singled out for its relatively smooth democratic transition after the overthrow of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in 2011. But 7 years after the Arab Spring, 9 successive governments have failed to fix Tunisia's economy.
Middle East.
The International Monetary Fund has put pressure on Tunisia and its neighbors to do better.
The region needs to take action to address those challenges and leverage today's opportunities so everyone can benefit.
Tunisia agreed to a $2.8 billion loan program in return for economic reforms.
The government's top priority, even when making tough decisions, is to improve the economic and social conditions of the people and return trust in their country.
But that trust appears at its most fragile in years, as protests intensify and the army moves in.
Angry crowds denounce the arrests of hundreds of people. The government says those who have been detained were involved in attacks against police stations. The protesters, on the other hand, accuse Tunisian authorities of an indiscriminate crackdown.
The biggest problem is with those who govern us. Nothing has changed in Tunis. It's the same elite that govern us, the same tactics. They clamp down on our freedoms. If you express your views on the streets, you end up in jail. The police are chasing us.
The police have been given strict orders not to use force to disperse the crowds. These are tense times in the country. Protesters are venting their frustration at the government after it introduced austerity measures and increased taxes. Officials here say the measures are crucial to eliminate a budget deficit and improve declining revenues from agriculture, mining and tourism, Tunisia's vital economic sectors.
We want the government to scrap the tax increases. Many people are suffering because of the price rises, particularly in poor rural areas like Sidi Bouzid, Gasserine and Thala, where communities have been grappling with discrimination for decades. The decisions made by the government is against the will of the people.
Prime Minister Youssef Chahid has visited some of the areas of the protests. He's accused the Popular Front, a coalition of leftist opposition parties, of inciting unrest. But the opposition insists the rallies are legitimate expressions of frustration over a government they say has betrayed its own people. Army units have been deployed in many cities to protect government buildings and prevent a descent into chaos.
This is a delicate issue for the government. If it backtracks on the tax increases, the budget deficit will continue to strain the state's finances. But if it goes ahead with the austerity measures, public anger might lead to further instability. Habib Bourguiba, Aljazeera, Tunis.
Tunisia has seen a third consecutive day of violent protests. Since the first rally on Monday, more than 600 people have been arrested, with 1 killed and around 50 injured.
now witnessing the third day of violent protests across Tunisia, both in the capital of Tunis and in at least 10 other locations. Now, the protests started peacefully, but since Monday night, they've taken a violent nature. And just last night, Wednesday, more than 300 people were arrested. The army has been called in to try and deal with the situation. They're being used to protect government buildings. They and the police have accused protesters of attacking government officials, of trying to take over shopping centres, of blockading roads, for example, whereas the protesters in response have accused the security forces of using a heavy hand and conducting a heavy crackdown. All of it is in response to the government's announcement at the beginning of January of their 2018 budget plan. Now, this budget plan has seen a dramatic increase in taxes on basic goods. So you have, for example, fuel increases, you have tax hikes on food items, and all of this is, of course, being met with fury and outrage on the streets of Tunisia. At the same time, we do witness similar protests happening in another country, also focused on the economic situation, and that, of course, is in Iran. But there is a noticeable difference. While there has been international outrage against the situation in Iran and the way the government is dealing with it there, when it comes to Tunisia, basically the international community is keeping mum. So, for example, with Iran, you had the French President Macron, you had the head of the European Union High Commission, and you had the American President Donald Trump basically calling for regime change. Here in Tunisia, same situation, and yet we're hearing nothing from the international community. And it might be because back in 2011, at the start of the Arab Spring, Tunisia was the first country to oust a dictator in a move that the Western world widely hailed as democratic change. But since then, there have been no less than 9 governments in place in Tunisia, and none of them have been able to get a grip on the economic situation there.
Tunis, the capital. Chris, what's the latest on those demonstrations? Are they ongoing today? If so, what are people telling you?
A lot of the protesting and clashes with the authorities tend to happen at night, but as you saw there, the protesting has continued in towns in the interior of the country. That tends to be one of the poorer parts of Tunisia, but it's also spread to the Tunis suburbs. And as you saw there, to Borbo, where a cause of some of the anger is the death of that protester. Back on Monday, there have been various smaller gatherings here in central Tunis today. And if you talk to people about why they are unhappy, it does really stem from that 2018 budget, one which, as you saw there, contains a number of tax rises and austerity measures, and which is put in place in accordance with IMF guidelines, and which has led also to prices rising, the price of basic goods rising. And I think one man I spoke to here today really sums up how a lot of people feel that since the revolution there has been this kind of bubbling discontent and anger at the politicians for failing to resolve some of the country's economic problems. As he put it, the politicians since that revolution back at the start of the decade now have come and gone, and the price of some basic goods has increased by 3 or 4 times, and wages simply haven't kept pace with that.
Well, you touched on it there, Chris, making reference to the revolution. This certainly isn't the first time that Tunisians have been out on the streets.
It's not, though. There have been these sporadic waves of protests, as I said, often in the poorer interior of the country. It's often things like price rises that initially trigger them. But as the report you saw there said, there are a number of kind of underlying structural issues which have proved a headache for the Tunisian authorities. It's not just the poorer members of society who have gripes with those authorities. For example, here in Tunis, where a lot of the country's middle classes are based, you'll hear people complaining about the fact that unemployment rate for university graduates, for example, currently stands at about 30%. Now, the government's argument, of course, is that, yes, these austerity measures are difficult. They've been promising that 2018 is the last time that Tunisians will really have to tighten their belts. After that, they say it will bring about the growth that the country needs. But at the same time, they will be keeping a very wary eye on developments. Parts of the opposition have called for further protests, notably here in the capital at the end of the week. The authorities have been calling for calm, calling for dialogue, holding out the possibility perhaps of softening some of those austerity measures, but at the same time obviously concerned about where these protests could ultimately lead should they continue. As you said, however, we've seen situations like this in Tunisia since the revolution, and it's anybody's guess really as to whether this movement continues.
All right, Chris Moore for us in Tunis. Thank you.